Today's focus is understanding the components and you saying, where am I with this component? There are 3 sessions tomorrow where we're going to drill down for Tier 1. What does Tier 1 look like in an MTSS model? Because it doesn't look exactly like it looks without it. Then what do Tiers 2 and 3 look like is another session, and how does that relate to Tier 1? And the third session is going to be, what does specially designed instruction look like for kids with disabilities in an MTSS model? Because it's very different. And in particular, we're going to focus on, what does specially designed instruction look like in Tier 1? What does it look like in Tier 2? What does it look like in Tier 3? What does an IEP look like in an MTSS system? Right now, I'm at the University of South Florida. I've been there for a while. I direct the graduate programs in school psychology, but most of my time is I direct the Institute for School Reform. We have about 109 people in that institute doing work for the entire state of Florida around RTI MTSS. All of the instructional technology systems for the state are in our institute. All of the school improvement stuff for the state is in our institute. The new Title I implementation centers under ESSA is in our institute. All the student services people for the state, school psychology, social work, counseling, nursing, etc., are actually in the institute, although they're housed in Tallahassee in the state office. All of the HIV/AIDS education, all of school-based Medicaid, all that kind of stuff is in the institute. And it's in the institute for a reason. And that is, we're kind of the MTSS center. So when you're looking at student support services, psychological services, social emotional learning, mental health, how does that fit into a multi-tiered system? What do all students get? School-wide positive behavior supports. What do some kids get? Tier 2. What do very few kids get? Tier 3. When we're doing HIV/AIDS education, how do you do that with everybody? How do you deal with Tier 3, which are obviously kids who unfortunately are infected with HIV/AIDS and are in school? So my point here is for you to start thinking about as we launch this, is that MTSS is a model that you use to fit everything you do into a delivery system. If something doesn't fit into the MTSS model, we tend not to do it because it becomes a silo. Does that make sense? So this MTSS system, the first thing that we often have districts do, by school or by category, whatever, we'll ask all of the general education teachers, what kind of services do you provide for Tier 1? What about Tier 2? What about Tier 3? Ask the school psychologist, what do you do for Tier 1? What do you do for Tier 2? What do you do for Tier 3? Ask special education teachers, what do you do for Tier 1? What do you do? And we get a resource map, and you know what we find? Big gaps in it. Huge gaps. And we find lots of kids going into those gaps and nothing happening to those kids. So this is a way of thinking that converts into a way of work. The most important characteristic of MTSS is that it's common sense. And if people make it difficult, then they're making it difficult. So how many of you have been doing some fashion of RTI for a while? Okay. I had an assistant superintendent in the last session said, you know, we've been doing RTI, that has gone well, or it's not gone well, you know, there's been some pushback around it, and I'm like, really? I don't understand that. How many of you are teachers or have been classroom teachers? Okay, as you were teaching kids in delivering instruction, in a teacher's head, when she or he is delivering instruction, what is the most important thing they're concerned about? What is the constant question they're asking themselves as they're teaching? Did they get it? So the number one question anxiety in every teacher's head when they're teaching is, how are they responding to instruction? They think RTI every minute of what they do. When the system gets a hold of RTI, we're able to provide teachers who are wondering every day about are they getting it with numbers. That's it. RTI is driven by the highest priority question by people who deliver instruction to kids, and that is, are they getting it? Are they responding to it? So the degree to which you keep MTSS as common sense and embed it in the work of the people you work with, it will make sense to people a whole lot easier than if you come in with a box called the MTSS box and people now think it's something else they have to do. So MTSS is not another thing. It is the thing. And what it makes hard for some people to grasp is it is a way of work. And I will say this up front to you. I believe you have all the tools you need to do that now. But they're all in silos. They're not organized. There's no glue to hold them together. You have different people knowing different things. You send kids off to places, and those places don't know what's going on in Tier 1. Tier 1 doesn't know what's going on over there. So the first thing about MTS is a common sense way to organize your services, and then to improve them after you find out what they look like when they're organized. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go through each of these components. I'm spending more time on some than others. Then I'm going to stop and ask you individually to rate where you think your school or your district or your system or the state is on that particular component. Give you some time to write down some comments, to let you think. At the end of this, I really want you to think, if we were to start implementing this systematically, what would we start with at a school level or at a district level? Okay, so we're going to have 5 tabletops. We're going to move fast. What I'm also going to ask you to do is, we're all experienced adults here. Like I said in the last session, the people who come to my sessions are gray hair, no hair, and colored hair. They're all people who have been around a while, right? So I'm going to trust that if I'm talking about something and you want to know more about it, or I'm confusing you, you will stop me and ask a question, okay? Isn't that what you want your students to do in class? You want them, if I can be sensitive to your needs, then you just let me know what I need to move ahead with. This website, I apologize for not having included it. It's just floridarti.usf, that's University of South Florida where I'm at. .edu is our institute website. I'm going to reference some materials. Everything on that website is free. All of our assessment tools, progress monitoring tools, all of the kinds of things that I'm going to talk about are nationally validated tools. So the school psychologist here doesn't have to worry about reliability, validity, factor structures, predictive validity. All of our tools have all of that. We spend a lot of time doing that. Our most recent tools that we've developed to do MTSS work is a chronic absenteeism survey that is student voices. We're just finishing the national validation of the one for parent voices. We've also developed tools for educators to complete and parents and caregivers at the school level for homeschool collaboration in an MTSS model. So there's a lot of good stuff that can support you, and it's all at no charge. Something we're not going to do today, but I want to put in context what we are going to do, is we have something called the SAM, the Self-Assessment of MTSS Implementation. It should have been SAMI, but for some reason nobody wanted it SAMI, so it's called the SAM, and it's just truncated. It is a nationally validated progress monitoring tool for implementation of MTSS. It is for building level use, aggregated to the district. So I'm just going to give you an up front. So let's say that in your particular school, you're a building principal, right? What's your name? Jan. That you have really focused on the multi-tiered system of delivery. and you've focused on use of data, but not the 4 other components, then as you give this tool either once or twice a year, you should see the effort showing on level of implementation. You put money into it, you put time into it, so it's constantly self-evaluating how we're doing. I'm working with a RESA in Michigan, which is kind of like a co-op here, except the RESAs and intermediate districts there are general ed as well as special ed. And they're using 4 of our tools. Perceptions of practices, how the staff believes practices have changed in the building. Perception of skills as a result of professional learning, what skills have they increased? The SAM, and then a belief survey to see if beliefs about how they educate kids have changed. And they administer those once a year, and they've done surveys, and it takes teachers 15 minutes to fill them out, and the data populate. They happen to use Google Forms, but you can use Qualtrics, you can use SurveyMonkey, a lot of things. So the SAM is much more comprehensive. This is the leadership domain. There are 5 indicators on it, and you assess yourself on each of those indicators, whether you haven't done anything yet or you're optimizing the implementation all the way at the top. So the self-evaluation form today on 1 to 5 is a mini version I've made of this for you folks, because we only have an hour and a half. So we couldn't do the SAM. It takes 2 days at least to train people on how to use the SAM. And I didn't think you wanted to come and sit here for 2 days, right? You have an evaluation form that looks like this for each of the tabletops, for each of the domains we're going to talk about. I will put up here 3 questions for you to ask yourself about each of the domains. And you can rate yourself on 1 to 5 and then come up with an average to put on your evaluation form. So each of these tabletops really has 3 questions, and if you put 5s on all 3 of them, then you'd put a 5 on this. If you put a 1, 3, and a 5, you'd put a 3. Okay, got it. All right, so let's get started. 2 basic questions that guide our work. Are you happy with your data? And is every classroom one in which you would put your own flesh and blood? I was a building principal for 10 years, and those are the 2 questions that drove my work every single day. How are our kids doing? And if I were a parent, would I be comfortable putting my kid in any classroom in this building and knowing they would get the same shot at education or not? Right? And every system is perfectly aligned for the results that it gets. If you're in a building or a district that has consistent results over the last 3 years and you're not happy with them, if you're happy with them, awesome. But if you're not happy with them, once you have 3 years of data for a school, those data are the data that reflect what your school has the capacity to do. And if you have some groups of kids that have not improved, it's not going to happen unless you change your capacity. Because once those data are 3 years of data, that's reflecting consistency and outcomes, and that's how you're organized, and that's how people are doing the work. And the data aren't going to change unless the system does. So in the state that I'm in, Florida, 4 or 5 years ago, we completely eliminated teacher tenure. I don't mean I did. The legislature did. And 50% of the evaluation for all educators, special ed teachers, general ed teachers, school psychologists, principals, counselor, everybody, 50% of your evaluation is based upon student growth. And that growth requires at least 3 years of data on each kid. If some of your kids, you don't have 3 years, you only have 2 years, the amount of your evaluation that the growth counts for goes down, because 3 years of data are stable, reliable data. Less than 3 years are not. So once you've got 3 years and you're not happy with it, something's got to change. And that's what this basically says. So we have 6 critical components of the MTSS model. I want you to pay, we have principals in here, we have district leaders, state leaders. So you've been through all these leadership courses and all of this kind of stuff. You understand that leadership, capacity building, and communication and collaboration are the bedrock of all change processes. They're not unique to MTSS. There are some things we're going to talk about today that are unique about leadership, that are unique about capacity, but the concepts are not. What is unique to MTSS are the other three: the multi-tiered delivery system, how we do problem solving, and how we use data. Those three are going to require more professional learning supports, coaching and technical assistance than the others. So we're going to spend more time on those three today. Is this making sense? Okay. MTSS can be implemented at any level, the student all the way to the district. And if you're a teacher, you know that you give something to everybody in your class, even a special ed teacher. Then you intensify it for some kids. And you further intensify it for other kids. But you hope you don't have to further intensify it for very many. Or if you do, you need to just change what you're doing for everybody, right? The same thing with the student. If we take a look at the 5 big areas of reading, that student may be just fine for Tier 1 instruction for some of those areas, but not for others. So we intensify supports even for individual students. But the same model applies. And it also applies at the elementary, middle, and high school levels. The model is identical. The high schools have some issues with scheduling, course code directory, credits. There's less flexibility there. But the model is the same. So your district or your school can do this. You need to have a definition of MTSS. This is our statewide definition, not suggesting you take it. I want to give you an example. So it is an evidence-based model of schooling. My 2 bumper stickers are, in God we trust, everyone else brings data. And data will set you free. I had a conference call before the 12:15 session this morning, talking with a district, and they have implemented a reading program with fidelity. They can demonstrate it. They have coaching. They have classroom observations and walkthroughs. They know their teachers are implementing this with fidelity. The data for the kids has not changed. So who do you throw under the bus? The kids, the parents. What do you do about that? You look at the data. So it was evidence-based. It is evidence-based. It's being implemented with fidelity, but it's not working. You don't keep doing it, or it's going to keep not working. You go back to problem solving and you got to pick something else. Because for whatever reason, that evidence-based did not line up with the needs of your kids. So you have to have some decision, some rule for making those hard decisions. So you have people that like direct instruction, they like balanced literacy, it doesn't matter. I've never gotten into a discussion about pedagogy, that kind of pedagogy or philosophy, ever. I don't need to. If the data aren't changing, it's not working for our kids. The adults may like it, but it's not changing the data. So that data will set you free. It'll set you free from these discussions about who likes the favorite method of teaching. We look at the data and say, are you happy with it? And if not, so that's what that part of it is. It's data-based. We integrate academic and behavior instruction. We don't have an academic team and a behavior team in MTSS. Because for every academic skill, there's an academic behavior. Behavior is not separate. Kids act out to escape a frustrating learning situation. There's nothing in school that separates behavior from academics. So we integrate it, and we'll look at how that works as we go along. The tiers don't exist. It's simply a model for intensifying instruction. So what is your school, and this is rhetorical, Jan, you don't have to answer it. What if you say we're going to intensify instruction for that kid? Everybody, if they're doing MTSS, would know there are 3 components to intensification. We'll also get to this. More time, narrower focus, and potentially a different strategy. So if you asked a teacher, how do I intensify? Well, the first thing I do is add time, next thing I do is narrow focus, next thing I do. to get consistency across staff. And we simply called that tiers 1, 2, and 3. We'll talk more about that in a minute. And at the building level and at the district level, our services are need-driven, based upon outcomes. So I work with a very large school district. We work with all 67 school districts in Florida. We're the second largest state now. New York is third. The reason for that is in the last 10 years, 600,000 New Yorkers have moved to Florida, okay? So we have 5 of the 10 largest districts in the state, in the country, yet the majority of our school districts in Florida are small and rural. You've never been to those, typically because you never go anywhere except Orlando, Busch Gardens, wherever you go. And those are massive population centers. But 37 of our 67 school districts are small and rural. We have 1 and 2 building school districts. And we have Miami-Dade with 500. So the model's got to work across all of these. So in Miami-Dade, there's a part of town called East Little Havana. And it was historically Cuban immigration, that kind of stuff. And there's East Little Havana Elementary School with 97% of the kids being free and reduced lunch and 98% speaking Spanish. 2.5 miles away is Coral Gables, same district, incredibly high socioeconomic. If you watch Trump come and go, just look a little bit left or right and you'll see, depending on the perspective, and that's where Coral Gables is. East Little Havana Elementary, those kids have 180 minutes a day of English language arts because they can't make it in 90 minutes. Coral Gables, 72. Most of the children born in Coral Gables at least come out. They add the APGAR index when they're born to just also check for sound symbol association. And most of those infants, newborns, have it. So they are incredibly entitled with social capital, educational capital. There's no need to have more than 72 minutes. But you can't teach English language learners to attain standards in reading if you teach them for the same amount of time as you teach kids who walked in proficient in the English language. It is impossible. So how do they get away with that? We use thematic instruction. We collapse reading, math, and science into themes and drive literacy through it all. So we can block large percentages of time. That school makes proficiency every year. Yet nobody there speaks English for the most part, and the whole school's on free and reduced lunch. So it had to do with how the services are delivered. Okay? We just finished working for 3 years with a school district in Massachusetts. They started implementing MTSS 3 years ago. Kids with disabilities, sophomores, 3 years ago, 29% of them made proficiency. This year, 82%. In 3 years, they went from 29% proficiency for kids with disabilities to 82%. They made some changes on how they delivered instruction, made changes on how people worked with each other. So you can move data, but you have to have a model and a consistency for doing it. You cannot do it with chicken droppings, tweaking here, tweaking there. It has to be, so that is what MTSS is about. So the last thing before we get into this, because we're in the tiered system, we're starting with that one. So tier 1 is answering the question, what do all students need? And another question, what does everybody in the building do to support kids in tier 1? What about kids in tier 2? That 14 or 15% of the kids who are getting more intensity. What can everybody do to support kids getting tier 2? What about the kids, the 5% who need the most intensive? The answer lies in the answer to this question. What is everybody doing to support? So that's why tomorrow, when we talk about specially designed instruction, kids for disabilities, the first thing we're going to do is talk about what does a tier 1 look like? How do you teach all kids? And we have elementary, middle, reading, math examples. How do you teach all kids and also meet the needs of kids with disabilities with the same instructional practice? We have a lot of instructional practices that are evidence-based for general population, but also are evidence-based to move kids with disabilities. So now you have a special ed teacher focused on some of those deficit areas, but when the kid is in the 90 minutes of ELA, that instruction is also evidence-based for SLD kids. They grow at the same rate as the kids without disabilities. What doesn't happen is the gap doesn't close. That's where you come in. But also what doesn't happen is they're not wasting the 90 minutes and getting farther behind. So for a special ed kid, it's going to take everybody doing something. But you don't want people to have to do more. So you don't want the general ed teachers having to, why would we, if we had a strategy like collaborative strategic reading, CSR, it's a way to teach comprehension, but it's evidence-based for kids with disabilities. So you have a teacher who's teaching everybody using one method of comprehension instruction, but it's serving two purposes. That's what MTSS is about. So we're going to start off by talking about this, the first domain of what does a multiple tier of instruction look like. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to bang some stuff at you, and I'm going to depend on you to say, wait, I have a question about that. And I am going to try to apply the common sense. So I'm not going to use a lot of jargon. I'm going to use just common sense. The multiple tiers of instruction and intervention is how you deliver academic and behavior instruction, how you intensify it, and how you integrate it. So, tier one. First thing you have to have in a building or a district is everybody knows common language, common understanding about the definitions. Very simple. Tier one is what everybody gets. That's all you can say about it. Because the example that I just gave with CSR, it's what everybody gets, but it's also evidence-based for 5% of the kids. How many of you are familiar with social skills training stuff? Yeah. All that social skills training stuff was developed as tier 2 and tier 3. Schools I work in, we use it in tier 1. We start, first fifth, we got rid of opening. We don't do that anymore. Because up here you have interesting opening. You can do weather, you can do that kind of stuff. We don't have those issues in Florida. It's always sunny, and the only difference is it's raining or it's not. So we don't need to go through all of these things in the morning. Instead, we have school-wide, everybody gets social skills training, and everybody gets 10 minutes of reading. Everybody in the school, including office people, school psychologists, custodians, everybody has groups of kids that they're reading with. And the more highly qualified those adults are, the more they focus on kids who need extra stuff. So as an example, in one school we work in, if you call there at 8 o'clock in the morning, it'll say, hi, this is just Keene Elementary. Nobody's available to take your call right now. We're all, I don't know the exact words, we're all reading with the kids until 8:20. If you need immediate help, push 3 on your phone, and it goes to the remote walkie-talkie kind of thing that the office person has and knows that there's a call that he or she has to take. So the safety of the school is fine. Everybody's involved in reading. Everybody's involved in social skills training. The skill of today is following directions. Look, listen, say, do. Steps. But if we said social skills training is for tier 2, then that would confuse people. Because in these schools, it's tier 1. Am I making sense with this? Because you can use different types of instruction for any tier. So it's what everybody gets. It's the widest range of curriculum. Reading, 5 big areas. Phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension. The least amount of instruction. Elementary, typically 90 minutes, and then middle school or high school varies depending if they're blocked or not. The fewest assessments. We might do benchmarking 3 times a year. We might do high-stakes assessment at the end of the year. But that's about it. And then whatever the teachers are doing. So it is the hand sanitizer for health prevention. It's what everybody gets walking into the grocery store. And it's defined by that. If everybody doesn't get it, it's not Tier 1. It doesn't matter what everybody gets. So once again, this is common sense. Indiana has a lesson planning guide that's awesome. It guides you through the steps of lesson planning, but the last 3 areas ask you to, how are you going to address in your lesson planning for Tier 1? How are you going to make modifications, accommodations, and specially designed? These are general ed teachers having to think about this while they're planning their lessons. Because otherwise, here's what happens. You know this. You plan a lesson, never thinking about the diversity in the classroom. You teach your lesson, and then the kids that it doesn't work for get referred for something, whether that's behavior or problem solving or special ed. We want to create universal education. So if you think about, I was actually working in Indiana in 1973. I started working here in 1972. 1970, for some of you, your parents weren't even alive at that point, or they certainly weren't married. And maybe they weren't even alive when you think about that. And the Voc Rehab Act, Public Law 89-313 was passed. Vocational Rehabilitation Act of 1972, 1973. And that was a precursor to ADA and all this kind of stuff. But there was a little unknown, unpaid attention to section of the Voc Rehab Act of 89-313. And it was known as Section 504. Section 504 was supposed to create universal education, the way that 89-313 resulted in cut curbs, wider stalls, buses that lower so that people don't have to have their wheelchair hauled on the outside. Things that if you go to a gas station and you need assistance, like I go to BJ's because that's cheap gas, right? And right down at the lower level, if you need assistance, you just push buttons and somebody comes and helps you. So we've removed most of the barriers for high probability issues, but we have not done that in our classrooms. And I'll ask you to think about one example. If you have a 6th grade kid reading fluently at the 2nd grade level, not above it, that teacher is going to be saying the kid can't do the work. How many of you have taught 6th grade, been near a 6th grade, did a drive-by from a 6th grade? Okay. I have never met a 6th grade kid with a 2nd grade fluency level who talks at their fluency level. They use the same words that everybody else uses in 6th grade because they know the meaning of the words. They know how to use the words. They just can't decode them. So universal education would require that every classroom at every elementary building, middle, and high school has text-to-speech and speech-to-text. Because that's the only way this kid's going to access content to the standards. So equity and access, the basic requirement is universal education. I travel more than the average person. Every airport I travel in, every hotel that I'm in the last 10 years, what has appeared in every airport, every hotel, on the wall somewhere? Defibrillators. They're everywhere. Do you have them in your schools? How many of you have? Yes. That's universal. Because if somebody has a heart issue, by the time somebody gets to them, in other words, Tier 3 or special ed, it's too late. So the environment is ready for high probability issues. And I will tell you, our classrooms are not. They are still, go to a lesson planning meeting. The lesson is planned for the typical kids. We're not talking about these other kids. How are we going to deal with somebody who's reading at the 2nd grade level, the 6th grade level, and they're in 6th grade? Universal design, we'll talk about that tomorrow, is embedded in the lesson planning process for Tier 1 by asking 3 questions. What are the different ways we're going to represent the instruction? What are the different ways we're going to allow kids to tell us what they know? And how, knowing our kids, are we going to construct lessons so they're engaging to the culture of our kids? And if you do that, your lessons look very different. You have fewer referrals, you have more kids engaged, etc. So that Tier 1, the big thing about Tier 1, in addition to what we've talked about, is it sets the scope, sequence, and pacing of instruction for anybody in that grade level. And our special ed person has to be aware of the scope, sequence, and pacing so that that instruction is aligned with the content, the scope, sequence. It's not going to do any good for Diane here to be teaching out of a box, Wilson's Foundations or something. Wilson's Foundations is great, but we're trying to build vocabulary. Why wouldn't she be aware of the scope, sequence, and pacing so she could have the 4th grade social studies book to apply the Wilson's strategies to, so that the vocabulary that the kid is working on with her is the vocabulary they need next week for the lesson. Pre-teach, review, and reteach are the most powerful tools for struggling students. Yet if our units, if Tier 1, 2, and 3, and specially designed instruction are not together, how do you do pre-teach, review, and reteach when no one even knows what the pacing chart is? That's a leadership issue. When I was a building principal, everybody had the pacing chart. It was our Bible. And we calibrated it constantly by saying where we are on that. So anybody doing instruction outside of that Tier 1 use the pacing chart to apply the strategies to. So kids brought their books. You can take a 6th grade book, Diane, you know this. There are 1st grade words in there, 2nd grade words, 3rd grade words. So why wouldn't you be pushing the 3rd grade fluency words for what they're going to be reading in class in a couple of days? And by the way, anybody who teaches fluency without teaching vocabulary is wasting time. You have kids reading words, ask them what does it mean? After they can read it, what does it mean? Most of the time they know, because now they know that what that is what I know the word. But you teach vocabulary and fluency simultaneously. You've got to teach the vocabulary for access to content. So Tier 1 is huge because it helps Diane understand what the order of her stuff is. And a thing for building principles in here, in Tier 1. I would never do walkthroughs or evaluations for Tier 1 first. I always did it for special ed, Title I, EL instruction, before I went into the general education classroom. Because then I wanted to see how the general education classroom was inclusive or not, but I had to know what Diane was doing. I had to know what the title person was doing with those kids, and I had to know what EL instruction looked like before I went to see, does it work? So the general ed classroom was the last place I went. And in an MTSS model, you have to evaluate all levels of the tiers. And Tier 1 was last because you got the context for it. So that's Tier 1. Tier 2 is what some kids get. Generally about 15% of the kids. Tier 2 is more time, narrow focus, different kind of instruction maybe, but our first approach to Tier 2, district-wide, school-wide, unless there's a reason to deviate, is a double scoop. We call it the double scoop tier. You simply re-instruct them again. I mean, look, I'm looking here at Jan. You know, the idea that all kids understand something at the same rate is ridiculous. And if we don't use Tier 2 as a double scoop, we then assume that kids who don't learn at the same rate have a disability or something's wrong with them. They just need it told to them twice, 2 or 3 times. Tomorrow I'm going to give you an example at Mashpee High School of how we use double scoop to drop failure rate in Algebra 1 at 27% to, as of June of 2017, not a single 9th grader failed algebra. All we did was change the schedule and use this concept of a double scoop. So don't make it more complicated. And you know what we tend to do as well is jump from Tier 1 to Tier 3 into special ed. Remember, only 12% of kids total are kids with disabilities. So there's an 88% chance that a struggling kid does not have a disability. Why jump to that bucket to begin with? It's craziness. Only 4% of kids have a learning disability. If you have more than 4% in your district, you're either having a pity party for kids because that's the only help they get, or you're afraid of their parents' attorneys coming after you if you don't do it. The epidemiological rates for SLD is 4%. The national component is about 33% of kids with disabilities are expected to be SLD. So 33% of 12% is what? 4%. That's where they get that number from. And we work with some school districts that have 8, 10, 12% of their kids in SLD. And it's like, really? I need your water tested. It's not possible. So what happens is you either wait too long, kids too far behind. So that's important stuff for Tier 2. And for each of these tiers, there are curriculum characteristics. I've already talked about some of these. So Tier 2 is a double scoop. It's more time. It's narrowing the focus. And you can take a look at those, but those are district criteria. And if your district isn't doing this, but you're launching it at the school, then just do this for yourself. Common language, common understanding. What is Tier 2? What is the purpose of it? Who does it? So that if I'm Diane and I'm a regular ed teacher, and I have my class organized where I have 45 minutes of ELA and group stuff, and then I'm doing centers, I may have one group of kids that I'm guiding the work of the other groups, but I'm going to come back and reteach for 20 or 25 minutes. That teacher's now doing Tier 2. Doesn't matter who does it. Not everybody's getting it. The strategy is a double scoop. It defines Tier 2. Somebody else could also do it. Doesn't matter. It would still be Tier 2. So the person who does it doesn't define the tiers either. It's only who gets it. And I already talked about that. Tier 3 is different. Tier 3 are for kids that have probably a 95% chance or greater that when you give them a task, they can't do it correctly. They don't have the capacity. So Tier 3 is characterized by two things. High levels of scaffolding, scaffolding for success. So what is strength-based learning? In scaffolding, the teacher provides the supports for the things the kid can't do, so that when the kid adds the things he or she can do, they're able to do the task correctly. And as the kid can do more, you remove the scaffolds, gradual release. The second part is this absolute need for errorless learning. So we want the kid to get the answer right. And if the kid can't do it without scaffolding, then the general education teacher knows this. When they're doing work that the kid can't do without a lot of help, the kid has another seat work assignment that they can do that's related to that one. But the kid knows that they're not supposed to do the grade level thing until the teacher comes. And in an integrated multi-tiered system, no general ed teacher has to wonder about how to differentiate for a kid, because the special ed teacher has told the teacher how to do that. So at the minute that, what's your first name again? Sheila. The minute that Sheila is now working with Jan one-on-one, and even if you can only do that 3 or 4 times in a period for 3 or 4 minutes, you are using the specially designed strategy for fractions or whatever that you do with her. So now, even though the SLD teacher only sees her for maybe 40 minutes a day, if you are spending 3 or 4 occasions of 3 or 4 minutes each with her every day, now you've got 12 extra minutes times 5 days in the week. She now has another 60 minutes of specially designed instruction. So now she's getting 102 minutes instead of 42. And all you had to do is say, when I'm doing fractions with her, tell me what you're doing so I know what to do. You don't have to sit there and wonder, because you don't know what you're doing with that. So you're going to try with good intentions, but you're going to come up with some differentiation that's based on your knowledge base, not what is evidence-based for her. Same thing with reading or what have you. Is this making a little sense? Okay. So Tier 3 is only about 5% of the population. So we have instructional characteristics for this, and I gave you the errorless learning, that kind of stuff. And by the way, just as an aside, we never do Tier 3 one-on-one. We will have 3 or 4 kids in a group. We'll give instruction individually, but give them a break, go to the next student, maybe modify the instruction, but they then can listen. If it's a fluency group or a comprehension group, they're all benefiting from the incidental instruction. And you can't do 45 minutes with an individual kid or 30. You wear them out, particularly if they're 5 years old. They will wear you out. After 15 minutes, you're going to get punished for trying to do this. So you have to have some guidance around that. Specially designed instruction, I want to talk about the difference between intensive Tier 3 and specially designed just for this moment. Intensive instruction, and just listen to this, it's up here, but is designed to reduce or eliminate barriers to instruction that are not the result of a disability. So it could be background knowledge, it could be frequent flyers, it could be language, it could be a variety of things, cultural differences. It could be, but it's not a problem inherent in the kid's ability to learn. Specially designed instruction is instruction that is evidence-based to reduce or eliminate barriers to learning that are the result of a disability. So you always have to ensure, building principles, this is incredibly important, that when you're in IEP meetings or you're in problem-solving meetings, you have to be sure that whatever instruction was decided upon, look at somebody at the table and say, where did we find out that this is evidence-based for kids with dyslexia? And if there's crickets at that moment, then you have to wonder, with all the expertise at this table, how are people coming up with specially designed instruction? Or is it just more intensivity on what they do with everybody else? So we're going to talk about that tomorrow. Where are your sources of specially designed instruction? Across levels and across areas. So I just went through those. And remember, this is the federal look at multi-tiered system. The white is specially designed instruction. It's not a tier. It's embedded across all tiers. So that's why tomorrow we're going to start out by saying, what are examples of specially designed instruction in Tier 1? And it's not Sheila coming over to work privately with Jan. It's what Jan delivers for the whole group. How does it link with Tier 2? What's the purpose of Tier 2 when you have special education being delivered? That's really important. Okay. The last thing, and I said we were going to be talking about this one for a while, we're almost done, is the Dr. Seuss approach to designing instruction. Time, what, who, and where. This is the order it has to be done in. So I'm going to take special education as an example. And Diane, this doesn't resemble you, but it's the easiest example to understand. So Sheila here was, do you do math, but for like SLD kind of stuff, or?
It's a little bit of everything.
Okay.
So everybody.
Okay, that's perfect. That's great. So let's say that the team decides Sheila is going to go to Diane. Diane is going to, in some way, be influenced by how much time you have to work with Sheila. What if what Sheila needs time-wise is more than what Diane has? Now, I don't care how powerful the instruction is, because you've cut the time, you've cut the impact on the instruction. We always have to say how much time is needed first. And let's say we only have 30 minutes, but let's say that Sheila really needs, but all we have is 30. We then have to design powerful instruction for 30-minute block. We can't take 60 minutes of instruction and cram it into 30. It will weaken the instruction. Time first. Once we have the time, what are we going to do with the time? And once we have the time and what we're going to do, we then go looking for a who. The who has to know how to do the what and has to have the time. Because even if the who knows how to do the what, but the who doesn't have the time, hence the Dr. Seuss thing. And it doesn't matter where it's done. Where it's done at one level, we'll talk differently about this a little bit tomorrow, is less important than being sure that the time, the what, and the who have got it. So that is one of the reasons why in our places, sometimes a title person or someone else is more qualified to deliver the what. So it's still specially designed instruction in the case of kids with disabilities. It's just not delivered by a special ed teacher, and nobody's ever said it has to be. We just make up rules. We have a lot of rules in education that are similar to the common law marriage. Once you've been doing it for 7 years, whatever that practice is, you're considered married. So whatever you're doing, whether you're living together, whether you have kids together, whatever it is, most states have a 7-year, if they can show a partnership for 7 years, they then define that as common law. We do that in education. We've always done it that way. We've done it that way for 7 years. So we got to take a look at that. So here's what I want you to do on the evaluation. We've talked about common language, common understanding around the tiers, what they are, everybody, some and few. We've talked about the characteristics of instruction being common language for everybody. We've talked about how we develop instruction, time, what, who, and where. So it's a systematic process. So I want you to rank on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being lowest, 5 being highest, in response to these questions. Our school focuses first on improving core instruction to improve the outcomes of all kids. Our school has clear definitions of what Tier 2 and 3 instruction is and looks like. Our school has a clear definition of what specially designed instruction is and looks like. So we don't do any of that as a 1, we're doing all of it as a 5. Do a quick rating, share it with someone at the table, and I'll give you 1 minute to do that. And then is what work do you have to do around multiple tiers of instruction if you're going to do MTSS? Okay, if you could wrap it up. Put your hand up if you think that if you're going to implement MTSS, it would be important for you to get this multiple tiers of delivery as a starting place to get people to understand. And give me an example of an area that you would prioritize for additional work based upon what you've already done. Where would you start? Thank you. Awesome. So can I give you one quick example? And we're going to go, we'll be okay time-wise because I've embedded stuff with every other component in this early discussion because this is where everything happens, right? I'm going to give you a reference. I'm awful at book names. The color is blue and kind of like a burnt orange. And it's done by Kathleen Lane, L-A-N-E. And it's called something like Instructional Behavior Supports or Behavior Supports for Instruction, something like that. There are 6 behavioral practices. And Rose, I really appreciate your bringing this up. Did you have a question?
No, I think that book is out there.
Oh, it may be. Then go take a look at it later. I'm going to give you an example, okay? Allison over here is a student of yours, and she has got a very hard time paying attention, is easily distractible. You never know if she's on task or what have you, and she's a bit non-compliant, okay? So there are 2 practices in that book. One is opportunities to respond, and the other is positive behavioral sequences. These are 6 behavioral strategies you embed into the delivery of instruction. They're not waiting till the kid to have bad behavior. So opportunities to respond is a standard practice. It increases the outcomes for kids who are struggling learners because you call on them more frequently. And that way you find out if they know something. If they don't, you can scaffold it. But it also keeps them on their toes. Because the more minutes that they're engaged with you, the fewer minutes they're going to be disengaged. And they're getting reinforced by getting your attention, but for appropriate things. And now I know that I want to ask her to do something, but she's likely to be non-compliant because her first response in her head to everything is no. Even though she doesn't say it, it's no. So I'm going to say, Allison, could you run up? I left my clicker up at the front of the room there. Could you go get that for me? I'd appreciate it. And of course she will because it's not sitting at desk work. So she goes and gets it. Oh, I'm sorry, Allison, I forgot. I needed a pencil up there too. Do you mind going back? She goes, no, I'll go get it. And now the 3rd time I'm going to ask her to do what I know she didn't want to do to begin with because I now have positive momentum for compliance. So every teacher should know positive behavioral sequences for non-compliant kids. It works like magic. And you watch teachers, I'm afraid, I don't want to ask them to do that because I'm going to get into a battle with them and blah, blah, blah. So for me, the first thing, Rose, is the behavioral strategies we embed in the delivery of instruction, which prevents the behavior problems. And then second, what do we do if and when they occur? So those 6 practices, instructional choice. I will say, Allison, You have a choice of how you want to answer this. It's totally up to you, okay? I don't even have to know, you just decide. That immediately, for kids who have control issues, for non-compliance, I just put the choice for you. I get to make a choice. So increasing instructional choice, as opposed to one size fits all, you got to do it. And those strategies, those 6 strategies, when I do classroom observations, I do a lot of them. And when I was a principal doing teacher evaluation, I did 3 things. I coded 3 things. What was the instructional strategy being used? I then coded student engagement, on task, off task. And then I coded the degree to which the behavioral strategies were embedded in instruction. Because it takes all 3 to keep kids engaged. Not stand and deliver, kids misbehave, they go have some discipline issue, what have you. And some of our coding, for example, at the high school, we code teacher instructional practices, explicit support, whatever, and kid engagement. And what we find out is that often the strategies that teachers use the most are the ones that kids are least engaged in. They have the other strategies, they just don't know the relationship between the strategy and engagement. So you simply tell, you know, when you were doing this, you had 85% of the kids with you. When you're using this approach, you were down to 40%. Then the teacher makes a choice, give instructional choice. It's not like they didn't know the strategy, you saw it. And so did the kids, and they engaged. But it's hard to teach and also simultaneously watch the kids from an analytical perspective. So that's the first level that we look at the integration of the 2 rows, is that embedded in the pedagogy first, and then the other part of it. But we also divide, I'm not going to talk about this today in depth at all, but since you brought it up, we divide student behavior with 3 things: academic skills, academic behaviors, and then intra and interpersonal behaviors. What academic behaviors does the teacher expect the kids to have to engage the instruction? So if they're doing centers, they have to work in a group. They have to share, they have to take turns. So for every academic skill, you are assuming certain academic behaviors. And if you're familiar with skill streaming, your school psychologist maybe, their skill streaming is a social skills training program. It can be used in groups, school-wide, etc. For early childhood, elementary, and secondary, the first set of skills in every one of those curricula are called classroom survival skills. Those are the academic behaviors. Those are following directions, answering a question, ignoring distractions, setting a goal, self-monitoring, self-instruction. Those are all the things that teachers expect kids to have when they are determining how much supervision they're going to give or not give during instruction. So these are things that you can keep pretty simple. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at quickly, and I want you to keep your pencils out, is data. So I'm going to go through this, and I want you to write yes or no, whether you have this. Early warning systems. Do you have them? Yes or no? And if you have to ask what they are, the answer is probably no. Health and wellness checks. That is aggregating data at the school level to see if overall kids are getting better in your school or getting worse. Formative assessments of some kind. Yes or no? Summative assessments. Those could be state level exams, standards aligned exams. They could be end of course exams in high school. Yes or no? And then systems level assessment, looking at overall things like disproportionality. Are more of our economically disadvantaged kids attending school less? Are we suspending them more by race, by socioeconomic status, by language, by gender? Things like aggregating all the data in a district to see how kids are doing. I'll give you an example of that. So the one that you probably, don't have is early warning systems. I'm going to give you a name for you to Google if you're interested. The last name is Balfanz, B-A-L-F-A-N-Z. Robert is his first name. Just Google him and put early warning systems. And you will go to the National Early Warning System Center. The bottom line of early warning systems is this, is that your data that you already have And for the most part, it's the ABCs: academics, behavior, and credits. There are some other things, but you already have the data. You look at them individually. But the interaction of them is where their power lies. So in Florida, and a lot of other states, but I'm just talking about Florida because that's where I live, we passed about 4 years ago Senate Bill 850. Every middle school has to do early warning system implementation. And any student with 2 or more indicators must have a problem-solving team, look at them, address them, involve the parents, because 2 or more indicators have a huge predictive value for not graduating on time. And we can start these at the 3rd grade level. We can predict with pretty good accuracy with the right indicators whether or not kids are going to graduate on time and their post-secondary outcomes. So early warning systems could also be screeners. Renaissance Learning just came out with a new early literacy screener that has 5 items on it that are that's screening for dyslexia. And they're giving a high probability of who's going to experience dyslexia before they ever learn to read. So that is an early warning system. In Florida, we typically do not use vendors for our statewide stuff, but in this case we did, because this screener is awesome. It was vetted by our Florida Center for Reading Research and the University of Florida's Reading Research Group, and they're like, you're not going to develop something like this on your own. And it also was being responsive to the dyslexia community that is increasingly becoming very concerned about this. That could be an early warning system. Our kindergarten screener up until this time was tied to our early childhood. We have free early childhood in Florida at the 4th grade level. And our screener was used to evaluate those early childhood centers because the state paid for them if necessary. And what we found out was that kids who went to 4th grade pre-K, 92% of them, it didn't start that way, it started with like 60%, 65%, but last year about 90%, 92% of them passed the screener. If they didn't go to pre-K, that number was 52%. So that screener let us know who needed extra help from day one. Because if they couldn't pass the screener, there was virtually 100% probability that they would not meet early literacy standards by the end of kindergarten. So it became an early warning system. Early warning systems are data that are designed to give you more time to close a gap. Okay, so now some examples. Healthy schools are places where kids improve over time. So how do we judge that? What is the effectiveness of instruction? We have an effectiveness of instruction when 80% of our kids at a classroom, a grade level, in a school, or across a district are either proficient or lowering their level of risk. So in an RTI model, colors are good. Green is good. If you move from red toward green, any of you use star reading, star math with Renaissance Learning? Familiar with it? Yeah. They have 4 colors. They have blue in there. That's on watch or something like that. It was green, blue, yellow, and then red. If you are lowering your risk moving toward green, that's a positive response to intervention because you're closing the gap. If you stay in a color, whether you're using Dibbles, Ames Web, or any of those kind of things, if you stay in a color, it's a questionable response to intervention because you're improving. You have to be improving because the expectations for staying in that color are increased across time. To get in the yellow, you might need 13. The first time, and the second time in January, it's going to require that you get 17. You're improving, but to go to the next level, you would have to get 23. That's closing the gap. So moving toward the green is positive, staying in a level is questionable, moving toward the red is a poor response to intervention. We don't even need numbers. We just look at the colors. Keep it commonsensical. So with all of that, I want you to look at these data. This is 3rd grade in a large Midwestern school district. It's not in Indiana. You could look at this, Jan, as a building level, or Rose as a building level. This happens to be all third grade reading data for the entire district. Left is fall, middle is winter, right is spring. If you're the superintendent or the chief academic officer looking at these data aggregated at the district level, are you happy, yes or no? It's getting worse. Yellow's getting bigger. So basically we can tell parents, look, the first 6 or 9 weeks is pretty good. After that, the probability is your kid's going downhill. This is an unhealthy curriculum because kids are getting worse. That's what health and wellness checks are about. But you have your data. You're just not looking at individual kids. You're aggregating them. Is this school a place where kids get better? If you're looking at behavior data, Rose, you could take a look at office discipline referrals. You could take a look at attendance. Is it getting better or is it getting worse? And we all know that right before Christmas, things tend to fall apart. We have our good months and our bad months, right? But you look at those trend data. At the high school level, we look at Fs every grading period. Are more kids getting Fs because that puts them in credit recovery, which is a huge risk factor? Or are fewer kids getting Fs over time? If more kids are getting Fs, then the school is toxic. It's becoming a place where kids are more likely to fail. So that health and wellness of a school is important. Because I talked about the teacher evaluation before, the teacher evaluation is moderated by school level data. Because the health and wellness of a school is known to impact all the teachers in a school. So healthier schools have higher expectations for teachers. Less healthy schools, less is put on the teacher and more is put on the school. Does that make sense? Okay. This is formative assessment. This happens to be from a school district we just finished working with. Fall data, 63% were at or above proficiency on watch. This is the Renaissance. They use Renaissance on me. 11%, 9%, and 18%. Look at this percentage here. 27% of these kids were either needing intervention or urgent interventions. That's yellow or red. In January, that number dropped to 14%. Almost a 50% drop. Proficiency went up by 10%. On watch went up, but that's okay because why? Because the red and yellow were moving up. It's a very healthy school for their reading curriculum. And that's the level of health and wellness that when we're doing our benchmarking data, instead of looking at a bunch of individual kids, the principal first aggregates the data and say, overall, are we getting better, are we the same, or getting worse? Because once you get down below that, you start then talking about kid issues, all of this kind of stuff, and you get away from the environment issue. Look at this one. For those of you who are elementary principals, this is kindergarten data. It's a full year of data for early literacy, and it's the first assessment and the last. If you're the principal and you look at that, are you happy with this kindergarten or not? Look at the far left-hand column, look at the far right-hand column. Yes or no? It should be yes, absolutely, Jan. Look at the mess in the first one. In the last one, everybody is proficient except the red is a kid dropped in. They dropped in the middle of the year. It's a new student. And the white is a kid left. Look at the proficiency at the kid who left on the left-hand side. What colors do you see? Look at the left, same row, green. This isn't always the case. The kids that leave your building are copper, and the other ones that come in drop in red, right? Yeah. But other than that, everybody was fine. One kid was yellow, but look at where the kid was until then. If you're a building principal, what would you say to the teacher about that one? The kid has been proficient or above all year long, and then scores at a moderate level of risk. What do you suspect first? The kid? No, reassess the kid. It's not likely that the kid really bombed in the last part of school. Previous behavior predicts future behavior. So before you start getting into kid issues and blah, 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 just reassess the kid. Say, in 2 weeks, do it again. Let's see what happens. So you can make good decisions quickly. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 5, rate each of the following statements. Our school collects data on a regular basis to assess the effectiveness of Tier 1. Our school collects data frequently to assess the effectiveness of Tier 2 and 3, and our leadership team reviews it for the health and wellness of the school. Overall, we never do any of that. We do some of it, we do all of it. And then say where you think how much of a priority is focused on data. And then share, I'll give you 1 minute, share your number and share your thoughts. Okay, if you could wrap it up. And by the way, obviously this PowerPoint and the rating form, you can delve deeper into this later if you want. My email is also on the front of this presentation, and you have the Institute. Please, if you have questions or what have you. So let me ask you this before we go on for the last 10 or 12 minutes. What would you think you would want to implement first as a priority? The multi-tiered delivery system or working on your data? The three-tiered system. You probably already have enough data to deal with that. If you focus on the data without working on the system, all the data are going to do is to continue to reflect what needed to be worked on the instructional side. So I have my fifth and last bumper sticker for today. Lead with instruction. That's all that changes student performance. I don't care how many IEP meetings you have. I don't care how many whatever meetings you have. It gets down to academic engaged time for quality instruction, which is the best predictor of student growth. It predicts it better than ability, race, language. More time you have with good instruction is the best predictor, and it cuts across all categories of kids. Kids with mild, severe, moderate disabilities. Just think about that. You don't get better at tennis or golf by going to tennis and golf meetings. The next one, leadership. I'm only going to hit this quickly, and I'm going to ask you to do the rating scale. District responsibilities. Schools are limited to what they can do on their own if a district does not adopt this. We do no work with schools individually. We only work with districts who allocate time, personnel, and resources to support school implementation. Because schools don't have the big bucks for new data systems or enhanced data systems. You don't have the big bucks for professional learning. You don't have the big bucks for policy changes. You're tied to district policies. So the district responsibilities are our policies and procedures consistent with an MTSS model? Are we providing support for the infrastructure that includes professional learning, targeted toward the priorities? So Rosa School may target one of these components, Jan's school may target another one, and the district has to respect those differences. Allocation of resources for the data and monitoring, implementation and outcomes. The district should be monitoring. In addition to the principals, they should be looking at those data too. Because the only data districts have is the data that comes from your schools. There's not district students. Everything comes up to the district. So what should they do with the data? They should look at all third grade, fifth grade, ninth grade health and wellness, and then break it down by schools and provide supports to schools differentially on their health and wellness around those areas. So you've got to have data savvy district people. They can't leave this just up to the buildings. A support system for principals. When we start implementing this, minimum requirement, non-negotiable, is a meeting once a month with the building principals of the participating schools, simply focused on problem-solving implementation issues. It's not an agenda item on a principals meeting. It is the meeting, minimum once a month. And the last thing is leadership evaluation. Jan and Rose and the others in here are principals or assistant principals won't like this. We've done a lot of research on it. When implementation of MTSS is part of the principal's annual performance plan, implementation is hastened by about 18 months. I resemble that as a building principal for 10 years. I was very aware of what was on my evaluation. And I took care of business. What is inspected is respected in order to do the fun things. But the building principles are not held to a common standard. You use the SAM to find out where you are. As a team, you set your goals for the end of the year based upon what you think you have the capacity to do and requests from the district, and you are held to your benchmark. So every building may be increasing at a different rate. It's not a one-size-fits-all. But you get to control what you're going to focus on and how far you think you can go. Now, if you go on the 20-year plan for implementation, you might get some pushback. But if you already have a bunch of stuff in place, you already have a leadership team, then you're going to grow faster. And if you don't have it, then you need to go slow and set that up. So the model here is go slow to go fast. One of the biggest barriers to implementing it is trying to do it too quickly. Every school should have a school-based leadership team, and the purpose of that leadership team and who is on it, you can decide, but the principal, assistant principal has to be on it. You got to have somebody who's data savvy, and you got to have somebody who's instruction savvy. That's a typical distribution of people. But what do they do? The first thing, or I'll come back to the principal. What does the SBLT do? The first thing that they do is monitor health and wellness. They are the facilitating team to implement MTSS at the building level. So when we work with districts, we increase the district capacity to support schools. But the school leadership team is the facilitating unit for a particular school with district support. That model is the only one that has shown to work. And you can look at everything that they do. Okay? But let's go back to the principal for a moment. I'm going to summarize all of this. The principal should model all the things she or he wants their staff to be. So you can't have a do what I say, not what I do. So modeling the problem-solving process. The problem-solving process, and we'll see it very quickly in a moment, has 4 steps to it. What do I want kids to know, understand, and do? Why can't they do it? What are we going to do about it? And does it work? We eliminated any term that was referral problem. It doesn't exist. When we refer kids, group of kids, individual kids to a support team, or we're thinking about them, we simply ask, what do we want the kids to know, understand, and do? The CUD. Don't talk about what the problem is. You don't want a kid to stop fighting. You can stop them from fighting by using Velcro and duct tape. They're only going to stop fighting if they develop the social skills and problem-solving skills to not fight. So we don't want them to not fight. We want them to be able to problem solve, walk away, ask for help. That's direct instruction stuff. We don't want to focus on reductive behaviors. And that's a system-wide approach to things. It's also part of restorative justice practices. So you need to model that. If somebody comes in, when I was a building principal, and I said this last hour, when I was a building principal, I'm also a licensed school psychologist, a licensed administrator, blah, blah. I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist. And at the time, because, and I'm not saying this because of all the things going on now, but my oldest daughter, who's now 46, left home when she was 11 and was an internationally competitive gymnast, was on the Olympic trial team, all of that kind of stuff years ago. And that cost a lot of money. And so in addition to being a building principal, I also had a practice working with families and kids and whatever. And if a teacher would come to me upset or, and I said whining, I don't mean that negatively, but like everything, you know, kids driving me crazy, blah, 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 the lingo. I would listen to it for 1 minute. And then I would say, you know that everybody knew I had this practice. So if we're going to talk more than a minute about this, we're going to do therapy. So give me your insurance card. I charge $125 an hour. Or let's move to problem solving. So if a teacher came to me, they already knew, because we did this collaboratively as a staff, that the entry level into bringing a kid to my office was, George, I want Sheila to be able to, she's not doing that. And I need help in getting her to be able to. Do you get the picture? And then the reason I think she's not able to, the teacher would say, and here's what we have done to get her to be able to, And here, so it was very proactive, very pro-social. We never talked about bad behavior. He's got to stop spitting on me. Okay, well, there's an answer for that. Cover his mouth with duct tape. Seriously. But what does a kid have to know and understand and do to not do that? Has nothing to do with spitting. Absolutely nothing. So modeling all of this type of stuff, modeling the data talks, modeling using health and wellness, we really are continuing to become a healthier place for kids. You want to model all of that in your words. And the good thing, principal's job is the best job I ever had. It was also the one that had the most control, self-control. Because you don't get to blink. You don't get to screw up and holler at somebody. You don't get to get frustrated to show your frustration, because now you're validating that, yeah, you're one of us, and leaders can't do that. Leaders have to be able, Russell Barkley, as soon as I said that, Joel Barkley, Russell Barkley is the ADHD guy. Joel Barkley's quote is a leader who takes people to a place that they would never go by themselves. So you can't be like them. You have to be the person that they trust to go someplace that they simply wouldn't go by themselves. And MTSS is a good example of that. So the principals, that's what the principal's role is. They also support the problem-solving process. So I want you to do rating very quickly here. We have a couple minutes. Our district has an MTSS implementation plan, yes or no? Or you're developing one? Our school principal supports and leads the MTSS initiative in our school. They are the face of MTSS. When you talk to a parent, here's what we want Sheila to be able to know, understand, and do. She's doing a really good job with some of it. But we really need to amp up our game a little bit to be able to get her to know and understand and do more of that. And we need your help, as opposed to whatever the conversation is. Our school has a leadership team that supports implementation and classroom teachers in the developing MTSS skills. So, where are you? 1 to 5. Circle something quick. So this last one is going to be easy. I've talked repeatedly about the problem-solving process. So here are the questions. We didn't have time. If we had time, I was going to go through it, but we don't. I have talked about the positive question. So, does your district, you can't have 5 different problem-solving processes. You have to have one the district adopts. So, these 3 questions. Our school has a problem-solving process that is used to develop, implement, and evaluate instruction and interventions. Our school has a supports for teachers implementing instruction or interventions, and the principal supports the use of the problem-solving process. Rate it 1 to 5. The purpose of problem-solving is when things aren't working, you don't know what to do, that's what you go to. You go to problem-solving. The last domain was increasing capacity, but we've already talked about that. A plan, professional learning, coaching and technical assistance, and evaluating it. So, I'm sorry it was kind of rushed today. I hope that you're taking something away from today. If you want to know more about any of these, we have the 3 sessions tomorrow. We're focusing on just one of them at a time. Thank you. Enjoy your night. I know you're done for the day. And see you tomorrow.